Okay, welcome to this week's Wednesday webinar. Today we'll be talking about urban soil quality. We have Nia Little and Jared Miller that will be speaking on that in a few minutes. I would like to thank our sponsors of the Women in Ag program, as well as their collaborators. The link here in bright blue, extension.umd.edu/womeninag, with all the webinars, as well as the recordings, the upcoming ones, as well as the recordings of past webinars. You can go to that, see the materials from the presentations, as well as the live presentations. So if you missed something or get disconnected, you can go there. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Jared. And if you have any questions, please feel free to type these in the chat pod, and please include all participants if possible, and that way both of our presenters today can see your questions. Thank you. Jared?
All right, thanks, Shannon. Can you hear me?
Sounds good.
All right. Okay, so in terms of urban soil quality, we are addressing soil contamination with vegetable farming today, which is a topic that comes up in urban environments, and we'll discuss why in a minute. But the learning objectives today are going to be participating in this training. You should learn how to assess the risk of soil contamination on your farm, because not all farms will have the same risk of contamination. Be able to sample your soils, interpret the test results, and apply basic remediation techniques. So mostly we're trying to let you know about what type of contamination could be there, but also so you don't worry about it, understand how you can interpret test results and not be worried if you do see a little bit of lead or something in your soil. So what is a soil contaminant? It is an element, a compound, or a chemical in soil that can cause health risks. Mainly in this case, we're obviously concerned about people. When you consider this health risk, you should focus on how this typically is more of a problem for pregnant women and children. We talk a lot about this toxicity, especially with heavy metals. So not everybody is affected the same. And that comes back to the concept of the concentration that determines toxicity. Because often people don't understand, we talk about toxic chemicals, that people themselves and animals can all take different amounts of any kind of contaminant before it actually has adverse health effects. So the concentration is more important than just having it there. And a good point is to talk about some of these micronutrients that plants need. Zinc, copper, things like that. Plants need those as nutrients. At very low levels, you can actually have deficiencies in your plants. At very high levels, they can be toxic, so you have to hit that right amount. So it's the same thing for people. So we don't want to scare anybody when we talk about it. If you find zinc in your soil, it's natural. It's supposed to be there. But at higher levels, if you ingest too much of it, it can cause a problem. But your body can process so much of anything. So some common soil contaminants. I have heavy metals bigger because those are more likely. Organic pollutants we're not really going to talk about today because they're a little different in how you deal with, and they're in very specific cases where you find them in your soils. But you are more likely to find things like lead, cadmium, arsenic, chromium, and copper from human activities, particularly if you're near industry. And in some cases, lead can come from lead paint and things like that. So heavy metals, again, you can see copper in that list. Once again, that's a micronutrient. So these metals, if they're too high of a concentration, are contaminants, but they can also simply be a basic soil nutrient. Some of these, like chromium, are not, or arsenic, are not a soil nutrient. So understanding concentration, I like for people to at least get an idea of what these units mean. When you see ppm, or parts per million, how much is that? And how much should you be worried about? So you can see that some of these are very, very low concentrations. So 1 ppm means 1 part per 1 million parts. And to understand that better, you have to understand that 1 pph is the same as saying 1%, 1 out of 100. So when you say 1 out of a million parts, when you see ppm in a soil, in milligrams per kilogram, is the exact same as ppm. It's 1 part out of a million. They're saying that for every million parts of a soil, you have 1 part of that. And it can be a nutrient, it can be a contaminant. So when you see these different levels, it can give you an idea. 1 out of 100 is a part per 100. So when you hear the word part per million or part per trillion, just think that's 1 out of a million parts. It's 1 divided by a million. Or if you see 50 parts per million, that's 50 divided by a million. That's what they mean. So they're very, very small concentrations. But again, depending on what the contaminant is, some take very low concentrations, some take higher concentrations before they're toxic to people. Even something like water can be considered toxic. You can drink too much water and have toxic effects on your body. So in a soil, 1 kilogram is a million parts of soil. So that's why parts per million and milligrams per kilogram, if you see these in soil test reports, they're interchangeable. They pretty much mean the same thing. Lethal dose 50 is another important concept to understand, because this is where we start talking about what's the concentration of something that's going to start to hurt somebody. So when you see an LD50 for all these different contaminants, if you read about them, it is measured by the EPA in their testing. It's the amount of an ingested substance that kills 50% of a test sample. That means for arsenic over there with an LD50 of 15, if you have 15 milligrams per kilogram or 15 parts per million of arsenic, 50% of the population they tested it on died. So an LD50 of 15 essentially means you have a 50% chance of having an issue, because every single animal and person might be able to tolerate slightly different levels. We can't get an exact number, but it at least gives you an idea of what this number means. 50% of the test subjects died and 50% survived, so definitely you'd want to have much lower levels than that. But you can see caffeine, if you have 200 parts per million, or alcohol, you have 7,000 parts per million. You can get those up to much higher levels before they become toxic. So that's what we mean by that concentration is important. Arsenic as a compound is much more toxic than alcohol, but alcohol is still toxic. So the smaller that number, what's important, the smaller the number, the increased toxicity, the more dangerous it is. It means a small amount can cause you harm. Bioaccumulation is the accumulation of a toxic substance faster than it can be broken down or excreted, versus biomagnification, which is the accumulation up the food chain. So if you've heard of DDT, DDT was something that could biomagnify. It would get in the environment, it would be picked up by plankton, which would be ingested in the fish and could be ingested by people or birds. So although the plankton might have tiny amounts, because that fish eats a lot of plankton, it magnifies in their tissue, and then in the birds they get a higher concentration because they might eat a couple fish. So biomagnification is the increasing of the concentration in tissues of the food chain, versus bioaccumulation, which is where your body can't break it down as fast as it accumulates, and then it starts to cause more toxic problems. So like DDT is a hard pesticide. It's resistant to breakdown. They originally liked DDT because it didn't have an effect on people, but because it was harder to break down, it could increase in concentration as it biomagnified, and that's why it was banned. So when considering your soils and how likely you are to find contamination or it is a problem, there's a couple things we like to talk about. You should understand soil maps so you can uncover some general information about your soils. They're very useful for agriculture, but they can also help you in talking about contamination. Soil texture is something I think is very important because it affects the movement and absorption of most contaminants. And then understanding a little bit about chemistry, which you can actually take back to texture. You can kind of interchange those when you talk about them. Your holding ability, if you've heard of cation exchange capacity. Your CEC can hold nutrients. It can also hold contaminants, but pH is going to be very important when we talk about the toxic effects of metals in the soil, and then how it affects the absorption of different soil contaminants. So soil maps are online if you've never used this. The NRCS Web Soil Survey is what we used for years, but the UC Davis Soil Web is actually a little bit easier to use now. And if you've got a cell phone, if you're standing out in the field, you can bring up where you're standing and look at the soil types. So you see there on the top on the right, and that's in Dorchester County, right outside of Cambridge. You can look at those different lines or all the different soil types, and you can click on that, and it'll bring up the soil that's beneath your feet there. It's just a general idea of what the soil would be. You can see the horizons and the clay content and the CEC and the organic matter, all different things that can give you an idea of what's the likelihood that the soil is holding on to different metals in it, and is it leaching things down the environment, because some soils are going to be more likely to leach things down into our groundwater. It's not going to be so good in urban areas. You can see that section down there, that map at the bottom, that's Baltimore City. I just picked a green area and clicked on it. And because those soils are disturbed, at the top there, that soil formed naturally. It's never been messed with. It has all these horizons. When you go in to do buildings, you know, they're going to dig down 6, 10, 12, 20 feet and mix that soil. It starts over in its age and has different sets of properties, and they can vary across that whole area. So the soil map might not necessarily tell you what's under your feet besides that thick, as they've colored it black for some reason, but sea horizon, which means they just don't know what's there. It's going to take years for this to form. So the soil map might not be as helpful in an urban area as it is in a rural area. In that case, it's good to have some soil tests, or at least get a good idea of how you can look at the texture of your soil on the surface. You can certainly reach down and take a feel and figure out whether you have sand or clay in that soil, which will give you a big idea of how well it's going to hold on to different contaminants, in particular metals. So there are different soil particles, sand, silt, and clay. Sand is the largest, clay is the smallest, and silt kind of splits them down the middle. Everything less than 2 millimeters in size is considered to be soil, and anything over that is rock. So when you ever get a texture, you're just thinking about things that are incredibly small, less than 2 millimeters in size, actually represent soil. And all these different textures, like sandy loam and clay, are all a makeup of these different 3 particle sizes. As you increase in clay content, as you go from something, say, down in that bottom left-hand corner that's a sand to a clay, or a silt to a clay, you're actually increasing the amount or the ability of that to absorb metals, because you typically have a higher CEC or a higher charge. So a clay soil is more likely to hold on to those metals, which there's 2 ways to think of that. In one case, it might hold them tight enough that it's not going to affect plants. They're not going to pull it up. But it also might mean that they're more likely to stick around on the surface of your soil. So if you are messing with that or inhaling or ingesting that soil, you're more likely to get some of those metals, versus the sandy soil that might have a harder time holding on to them. And then you have the opposite problem where they might leach down into groundwater. So you can estimate in this in the field. But there are lab analysis. They usually cost a little more. If you want to figure out how to do texture, which is a completely other hour-long topic, you can do a simple method between your fingers and thumbs, and you can look that up online and make a ribbon to figure out texture. But in general, you can probably figure out, if you felt enough soils, the difference between at least the sand and the clay. So you see that sandy soil has large particles. Water's going to leach through it very easily and probably carry most contaminants down below that surface layer. So even things like pesticides are more likely to move through a sandy soil, versus that clay, and even with that organic matter at the surface, are more likely to bond and hold on to those metals. So it's a good idea to at least understand what the texture of your soil is, and that'll give you an idea of where the contamination might stick around in your different soils. Soil chemistry, a lot of people don't like to talk about chemistry, but it's very important in soils, and if you can understand some basics about it, you can predict how well you can grow plants, but also how these contaminants will stick to soils. So CEC is very important. It's your cation exchange capacity. Soils are negatively charged, so they can hold cations, which are positively charged. So in most cases, if we're talking about soil fertility, we would talk to you guys about calcium, magnesium, potassium, all plant nutrients. They're all positively charged, and they will all kind of bond to your soil kind of like a magnet. They're attracted to that negative charge, but they're not held too tight. They can come on and off, so that's the exchange. So sandy soils typically have a very low CEC, so they have a low ability to hold on to positively charged ions. and clay soils have a higher CEC. So if you're on the western side of the bay, you're more likely to have a clay soil, and you can hold nutrients, but it also might mean that you hold on to metals because things like zinc and copper are also positively charged in soils. So in general, if you know the texture or you can see how dark colored that soil is and has more organic matter, they have a greater CEC, so they have an ability to hold on to positively charged things like metals. So this is just an image so you can get an idea if you haven't talked about CEC. It throws some people off, but it can be a pretty simple concept. That soil particle on the left has a negative charge. The calcium, magnesium, and that metal like aluminum, they're attracted to it kind of like a magnet. So it's not held very tight, but tight enough that it can, and they can exchange on and off into the soil water, and your plants can pull up those nutrients. So it's important for most of your soil nutrients. It differs a little bit with metals because, and this can actually be a good thing because it means they're not floating around the soil water, but things like zinc and copper can actually get closer to the soil particle. So out there on the right, you see that calcium, magnesium, potassium, all plant nutrients. They're further away from the soil particle. They're attracted to it like a magnet, and they can move on and off, which is good because they're plant nutrients, and your plant can get access to them, but the soil holds them just enough that they stick around when you need them. But metals like zinc and copper and iron and aluminum, they are more likely to get closer to that soil particle, partially because they're a lot larger and they can push this water out of the way and they can get close and they bond tight. In some cases, you can have zinc in your soil, and even though it's a micronutrient, it's not plant available because it's held tight. Another way to look at it is if zinc is a contaminant, it's held tight to that soil, so it's not moving around. The other side of that issue is if that zinc is held tight to the soil and you breathe it in or ingest it, then you've ingested it into your body. So that's the reason that although it holds it tightly, it's also something to worry about in terms of if you have high zinc amounts. And when Nia talks about remediation methods or how do you handle the soil, you want to make sure you limit ingestion of these particles if you come out with high tests. Soil pH is very important in determining the availability of these metals and how likely they are to be a problem in your soil. The good thing about pH is it controls a lot about how toxic these elements are, and most of the pHs we keep our soil at to keep our soil nutrient friendly are going to make sure that these metals are solids. So when your pH lowers, different elements start to dissolve in your soil. So that's why often we'll tell you, if you look at that on the right, you can see that iron is a micronutrient. But if your pH gets above 7, you don't have a lot of iron. So we tell you keep your pH between 5.5 and 7, and you'll have iron available to your plants. The same thing with manganese. But if you look below 5.5, see how wide that iron gets, and the aluminum, and the manganese, and the zinc. That's when they become toxic, because they can be in your soil and they're a solid rock. When they're a solid rock, they're not affecting anything. They're not going to damage your plants. They're not going to cause a problem. And you're not as likely to have an issue with them. However, when your pH drops, they increase in concentration because that rock dissolves and you start having a lot of it in the soil water. And in that case, you can have toxicity to the plant. So here you have like a zinc carbonate. As you increase your pH, there's carbonate in your soil, like adding lime, calcium carbonate, and that zinc's going to bond with a carbonate and drop out as a rock or a mineral. It's a solid, so you don't have to worry about it. But they aren't soluble ions, so your plants aren't going to be affected by them as a toxic element. So pH is important. So if you maintain the pH like you're supposed to, above 5.5 to 7, then you know that these metals aren't going to be toxic in your soils. The flip side of that is, if you take your soil test and you don't have any of these at toxic levels, you want to maintain a low enough pH that your plants have access to the micronutrients like manganese and zinc. So I know people don't necessarily like to talk about chemistry, but the takeaway points from that is that most of your toxic heavy metals are held tightly on soil particles, or they're going to be precipitated as minerals. They're going to be solids because of the pH that your soil's at. So you can have a test come back that says you have these metals, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be immediately available or bioavailable. It means it's not likely to be taken up by plants. So we talked about that biomagnification. In most cases, there are some plants that take up metals, but not many that do. But you can feel better that they're held tighter on the soil. And if you have the right pH, the toxic metals that like cadmium and things are going to be solids and won't be as much of an issue to your plants. However, if they're bonded to that soil and you're not careful and you ingest or you carry it into your house, that is the most likely pathway for you to get metals out of these contaminated soils. So do plants uptake metals? Well, obviously, micronutrients, they take up micronutrients. They can take up some of these metals. But there's a soil-plant burial that limits the uptake of most heavy metals in plants. Lead, nickel, and copper, absorbed to the soil, are limited by higher pH, unless you have a very high concentration. So you're not likely to find those in plants. High levels of zinc and copper are more likely to kill the plant, so you're not as likely to eat that plant. Leafy greens and herbs are the most likely to absorb different metals, which is why sometimes when they talk about soil remediation with metals, you might see plants, in some cases ferns, things like that, to take these metals out of the soil, but that's a very slow process. I don't recommend doing that in your garden to try to pull metals out of it. Cadmium, zinc, molybdenum, and selenium are the most likely to move up the food chain through research. Those different metals are more likely to move up the food chain. So most of your risk, if your soil comes back as having higher amounts of metals, is from particle ingestion, whether you're breathing it out in the garden, from your hands, or from soil on plants. So just because you have metals in there doesn't mean they're going to accumulate in plants. It doesn't mean you're going to pick them up. But you can see that there's some easy ways that you can deal with that by limiting the amount of soil that gets into your system. So some of the common soil contaminants, we'll talk about sites and sources, and mostly going to talk about metals. Lead is one of the most important. So you see, I talked a lot about some of the micronutrients because we understand that chemistry, like zinc. But lead is actually natural in your soils. There are natural amounts of lead. So don't be surprised if you see some in there. Again, that comes back to concentration. How much is actually going to cause you a problem? So some of the sources, we had leaded gasoline, was phased out in the 70s and banned in 1995. So you can imagine cars going down the road with lead coming out of their pipes would accumulate along road beds, things like that. Lead paint, which was banned in 1978. I just went through my house and stripped a whole lot of the lead paint from upstairs. And lead arsenate, which was a pesticide that was banned in 1988. So we're coming out like 20, 25 years after some of these materials have been banned, so they're not as likely to be in newer environments, but obviously you can think about along old roadways and older houses and in areas where they might use lead arsenate on farms. Maybe you have lead in that soil, so you can concentrate on looking in those regions if you're trying to find contamination. So roadways, cities, and older houses are good places to find lead. You will more than likely find some lead in your soil. It's natural, but was it increased by any of those activities is where you start to have a problem. So arsenic is likely been in treated lumber, pesticides, and industrial sites. So I did have somebody call me once because they had taken down their deck and wanted to put a garden in there. So yeah, I said you might want to check for arsenic in your soil if it leached out of that treated lumber. Cadmium, sewage sludge, smelting, mining, and nickel-cadmium batteries. Sewage sludge, it's a lot less likely to be in there these days. They do a lot of work of cleaning that stuff up. Chromium, again, treated lumber. Chrome-plated vehicle parts, so again, along roadways. Copper, treated lumber, car brakes, and sewage sludge. Again, that sewage sludge is not as likely to have it, but it could be there if they're not doing a good job cleaning it up. But think about something like car brakes, and another one would have been zinc, could also be in those areas down there. So you have lead coming out of cars, out of the gasoline, as well as things like chromium, and zinc that all are on vehicle parts. So along roadways, you might be more likely to find those. Mercury was in pesticides and obviously industrial sites. Selenium, industrial, coal and oil. And then another metal they worry about, zinc, which can be in tires, vehicle parts, air emissions, and of course in fertilizers. So if you look at most of these areas, they're more likely to be in urban environments that are older, that have industry, like Baltimore. So you have to know your site. You have to know where you're going and what you're looking at, so you know where to sample. In rural environments, you can have some of these. You're just not as likely. But again, you don't know what someone did on that property. Did they bury some old car parts somewhere that you might have to worry about this stuff being in your soil? So it is good to know the history of your land. We'll talk about organic compounds for a second. They're not as easy to talk about as metals because they can have a whole lot of different problems that we don't understand. They have a whole variety of properties themselves and how they can move through the soils. So solvents, things that we use to dissolve, dry cleaners in industrial sites. So if you bought an old dry cleaner lot and you're trying to put a garden in there, you might want to worry about that stuff. Pesticides, agriculture, railway beds. If you've been on the farm for years, you know it's been done there. If you bought a new farm, you don't know if someone in the 50s disposed of pesticides improperly. Are they in the soil somewhere? Creosote from railway ties and from chimneys, and petroleum obviously anywhere near new or abandoned storage tanks. So some of your site uses and toxicity. Around old houses is where you're more likely to find lead if they had lead paint on the outside of the house. So if you're going to put a garden in there, you might want to think about getting further away from the house. The older the house is, remember, anything before 1978. High traffic areas and roadsides. The further you are away from a road, I'm sure you don't want to put your gardens right up on a road, but think about how old that road is. It have a high traffic area. Along the edge, you're more likely to find lead, zinc, copper, chromium than in other areas. And then, was there treated lumber? Yes, if you pull out a deck or if you surround your garden by treated lumber, do you have to worry about arsenic, chromium, or copper leaking out of that wood? Most likely, I assume you're not going to start a garden on an old industrial site. That's more likely you find any of this stuff, but those are the spots I'd worry about the most. And then anywhere where sewage was applied or maybe different manures, you could find cadmium, copper, zinc, lead, or arsenic. It's not as likely, but it's definitely possible. So site history is really important when considering whether or not you're going to test and how much you really worry about this stuff being there, because it's not likely to be in a lot of spots. But if you're from an industrial area, if you're in an urban area, yeah, those are the soils that you want to test. Contamination is going to be limited and concentrated there more than in rural areas. Make sure you look in the past history of your land, so it's going to help determine what tests you can run. Lead paint is going to be near house foundations. It shouldn't be as bad the further away you get. Agricultural contamination is also likely to be close to old buildings where they might have filled tanks or spilled something. Automobile contamination close to roadways, and some general deposition of maybe metals that burned out near smokestacks. Okay, I'm going to pass the ball over to Niamh, and she's going to talk about once you decide you want to test your soil, once you're worried about what could be there, how do you do this?
Thank you, Jared. Hey, everybody. Thanks for sticking with us this far. I think that what Jared just covered about the chemistry of metals in soils is really important. Like he said, I know sometimes people see chemistry and they freak out a little bit and they think, oh, no, that's not for me. But I think it really is important to understand as much as you can and try to understand as much as you can about how the world works and how these chemicals might interact with the soil that you have, with your site conditions, and with the management practices that you use, like mining. What I'm going to talk about is, now that you have this context of knowledge, what you can do to collect a soil sample and find out more about your site and interpret the results, and then what practices you can use to reduce your risks if you have higher than background levels of heavy metals. My name is Mia Little. I am a local extension agent in Maryland, in Baltimore City actually, so this question comes up for me a lot. I work with urban farmers in particular. So once you decide you want to collect a soil sample to see what you've got, actually let's talk about deciding. I think that's really the most important thing. It's very easy to be frightened of what might be in your soil, but knowledge really is power. And there have been a lot of studies by our local USDA here in Maryland. Rufus Cheney's done a lot of work studying soil contamination in Baltimore. And like Jared said, in an urban environment, there are more potential sources for heavy metal, but it's not as bad as you might think it is. Not all the soils are contaminated at levels that you need to worry about, and it's much better to know what you're dealing with than to just wonder. So I definitely recommend getting your soil tested and seeing what you're dealing with, and then making good decisions based on that. And even if you're in a rural area, there might be sites that you might want to get tested. So here's an example of what might be an urban site. If you say you were going to start an urban farm or even a garden at this house, you wanted to start a garden or a farm in the side yard, the first thing to do when you're trying to collect a soil sample is consider what might be the highest risk area. What's the most likely part to be contaminated? Because if you take a sample all over, that might kind of dilute and mix the soil up. You might have a high level of lead or a heavy metal in one place and a low level in another, and the average isn't really going to tell you what you need to know. So looking at this site, you can see that I've marked some spaces out in red along the wall of the building, along the road, and along the driveway. And those are places I would think of might be particularly high risk for metal contamination because of sources that Jared mentioned, lead paint, leaded gasoline, maybe someone was doing work on the cars in the driveway in the past. Also, even if your house is younger than there used to be lead paint, or if you have a brick house like we have a lot of in Baltimore, when the leaded gasoline was a problem, the particles from that in the air would then drift and kind of stop when they ran into a wall and then get washed down the wall by the rain. So a lot of contamination from leaded gasoline is along the edges of roads and also along foundation buildings. So an example of a higher risk area, here we go. An example of a higher risk area in a rural area. If, say, you've got a farm in a more rural area, I've suggested a couple areas. Think about, again, near the roads. You might, if you're growing right up to the roads, you might consider testing there. Or, for example, let's say this building up on the hill here is your machine shop, and you do all of your oil changes and all of your machine equipment storage, or all of your maintenance up there. That would probably be a place you want to test for metal contamination. Or let's say that red blotch in the middle, what if you knew that that used to be an apple orchard in the previous iteration of this farm? Like Jared mentioned, lead arsenate used to be a common fungicide for apple orchards. So where I come from in the Northeast, there's a lot of lead and arsenic contamination of old apple orchards. So with that being said about choosing high-risk areas, you also want a sample that's representative of the whole area. You don't want to take just one plug of soil, right? Because that could just be a weird spot. So, for example, in that first site that that first hypothetical site that I talked about in an urban area, one way you could do it would be to collect multiple cores from that high-risk area marked out in red here along the edge of the road and along the foundation of the building, and mix those together in a bucket and have that be one sample you send off to the lab. then take multiple cores from what you might think of as your lower risk area, the interior of the field, and mix those well, and then send that as a second sample to the lab. And that way you'll have more information about where on your farm, whatever the results are, where those results are located. Like I said, it's good to take multiple soil cores. If you don't have a soil core, you can also use a trowel. The depth of collecting soil should be about your tillage depth, so how deep you're digging when you're doing your farming or your gardening, and usually that's 6 to 8 inches. And check with whatever lab you're sending your samples to for instructions on drying or not drying, and mailing your sample to them. A little bit about testing labs. There's a lot of different methods out there, and here we're going to get into a little bit of chemistry again, but bear with us. So any lab you send a soil sample to will do 2 basic steps. They'll extract stuff from your soil sample, and then they'll measure what comes out. Most of those extractions are based on adding either an acid or a base, or heat in some combination. For example, they'll take your soil and they'll shake it up with some acid, and they'll heat it, and then they'll put it through a filter to filter out a liquid, and then they'll use a different tool to measure how much, in this case, lead or arsenic is in the liquid that comes out. And there are several different tools that they can use for that. All these different methods that are out there, they vary in how strong the extraction is. So a stronger extraction will pull more stuff out of the soil. The nutrient tests that we're all familiar with for measuring phosphorus and potassium in our soils, things like the Malick or the Bray or the Olson, we've been studying those for many, many years, and there's been a lot of field studies where they correlated the results of those soil tests with yield on crops and with the availability of phosphorus and potassium and the other nutrients to your crops in that local soil. So we know, based on all this research, with a Malick test on the appropriate pH of soil, if you get a certain result in amount of phosphorus, we expect, based on all this research, that the crop will respond in this way. If you add phosphorus, you'll get more yield or you won't, based on that soil test result. The heavy metal tests, we don't have quite as rich of a data set yet as we do for the nutrient tests. So the standard tests will tell you how much heavy metal is in the soil, but they don't tell you as much about how much of that heavy metal could get into a plant based on that number, or could get into the body of someone that eats the soil, say. The 3 standard tests that are out there, the EPA has these tests researched and defined, and appropriate labs should be using to test the kind of standard. They extract, like I said, different extractions extract different amounts of stuff from the soil. So these tests, they extract more and more and more heavy metal out of your soil. And this one here, the 30-50 method, that's kind of the most standard extraction of heavy metals, and it's kind of considered to be close to the total amount of metal in the soil. So it's not like with the phosphorus test. Most of the Malick and the Bray and the Olson, those tell you the amount of phosphorus. Those are related to the amount of phosphorus that's available to your plant. So those are more availability tests, not total tests. With these heavy metal tests in particular, the EPA 3050 and EPA 3051, this is close to the total amount of heavy metal. It doesn't tell you anything about availability. There is a lot of research going on out there about developing new test methods to figure out how much of the contaminants in the soil are bioavailable, available to be taken up by the plant, or if the soil is physically eaten by an animal or a person, how much could be available and taken up by their guts. But those are still kind of in research right now. So maybe we can come back next year and give you a bit of an update. There are a lot of soil testing labs out there. The EPA runs a national accreditation program, but unfortunately that's a little bit more for large-scale brownfield remediation and industrial projects, like if you're building an apartment complex, you might send your samples to them. The University of Maryland Agriculture Nutrient Management Program, we have a list of soil labs that can be used for writing Maryland nutrient management plans. So if you're a farmer, you might be familiar with these labs. Unfortunately, no labs are on both of the lists, but on the Agricultural Nutrient Management Plans list, both Penn State and University of Delaware soil test labs, they offer heavy metal analysis and they use the EPA methods. So I would suggest using one of those two labs for your soil analysis. Here's a picture of the sample submission form from University of Delaware. If you zoom in, you can see these two methods are that EPA 3050 that I mentioned. There's a package that digests all the heavy metals. That's that extraction step I mentioned, and ICP analysis of the digest states. That's the part that measures what comes out in the extraction. So if you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 heavy metals you're testing for, 7 times 2, 14. So that's plus 5. So let's say 14 plus 12 plus 5, 17. So that's going to run you about $27. If you send it to Penn State, they have, it's a little bit simpler on their submission form. The total absorbed metals one, that's their EPA 3050 analysis. That one's going to run you $65. And that test, again, will test for cadmium, copper, lead, nickel, chromium, and zinc. And I definitely would recommend, if you're going to go to the trouble of taking a sample and sending it off to the lab and paying for it, it's worth looking at all the heavy metals, not just lead. I think it's better to know all of them. So once you get the result back, that's what most people struggle with, is how do you interpret the numbers that you get from the soil labs? Because I talked about it's a measurement of total or close to total heavy metals in your soil. It's not a measurement of available to your crop. Unfortunately, there are no federal standards for agricultural soil. The USDA doesn't have any official rules out there that say this is what the soil has to be for you to grow crops in it. The EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, does set standards for brownfield remediation. That's that industrial site. Say when I grew up in New York, Rochester, they have Kodak, and there's some site where Kodak spilled some stuff. That might be a brownfield. I know there are some other brownfields in Baltimore and Maryland. The EPA sets standards for then remediating those sites and doing other things on them. Those standards were never intended, were not intended for agricultural use, but they are what's most commonly used. And in the references at the end, you can see the EPA has a guidance document, a preliminary guidance document for urban agriculture, talking about using those standards for urban agriculture. Currently, the EPA threshold for lead is less than 400 parts per million for bare soil in clay areas, and about 1,000 parts per million for bare soil in other residential areas. So those are the numbers that you're going to see most commonly in anywhere that lead thresholds or the level of lead comes up. And remember, parts per million is the same as milligrams per kilogram in soil. Local regulators, however, might set their own thresholds, and I'll talk about that on the next slide. Baltimore City, where I work, is considering a soil safety policy for urban farms. It's optional for most places, but if an urban farm or a community garden is seeking to be zoned as agricultural use in Baltimore under their new zoning code, they would then need to go through this process. And it's actually, I know people, whenever there's a regulation, people get a little worried, but it's actually a very sensible regulation. I think it doesn't actually say you can't farm. It just says you have to, in order to get zoned, you have to take a soil test and have a plan for what to do about it. And it's and it's based on the EPA thresholds, which are the most liberal. There are local regulators that set lower thresholds, so it's based on the EPA thresholds. So here are some examples of numbers you might see. In this table, we've got the different heavy metal contaminants. Vermont and New York have published some background levels of these heavy metals in soils across the state. So those are sort of normal almost, or natural levels for those states. I haven't found one yet for Maryland. I suspect someone knows that there's one out there, so if you know of it, send me a message. I'd love to read it. I'll keep digging. And then over on the right, we've got these two columns that are more prescriptive use thresholds that different agencies have set. So on the far right column, that's the US EPA guidelines that I mentioned. Those are, excuse me, the ones below, the ones above which are not supposed to be using the land for residential use. The second column from the right is the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation's threshold. So that's an example of a local agency that has set a lower level that they recommend people use as a threshold. So in New York, if you have, for example, lead more than 63 parts per million or milligrams per kilogram, they recommend you use best management practices. So what do you do with all these numbers is the question. What I would say is, if you get your soil test, you can come back to this document. There are a lot of extension documents out there as well, or the test should send you some interpretation guidance with it. But what I would say is, if your numbers are close to kind of background level, they're like, for lead, for example, they're you know, less than 50. Those are the kind of background levels, and you don't really need to worry too much. If you have an amount of lead, for example, that's higher than 63 parts per million but lower than 400, I would say that's kind of elevated, and in the Baltimore Soil Safety Guidelines, they have between 100 and 400. Those are considered above background levels, but not above the EPA standard. So it's a good idea to use some best management practices to make sure that you're doing everything you can to be safe. And I would highly recommend using best management practices in that situation, and I'll talk about them in the next couple of slides. If your soil exceeds these EPA values, that's when I would definitely start getting worried. And I would say if your soil exceeds those EPA values, I don't know of any laws about it, but I would say you really need to be using remediation practices and have some kind of plan for what you're going to do to make the soil safe. And that includes having a hard think about whether this is an appropriate place to be growing food. I think there's a lot of worry about urban agriculture and soil contamination, and I think knowledge is power, and I think it's not as bad as we fear it is in a lot of locations. So I see a lot of soil tests throughout Baltimore, and I haven't seen one above 400 yet. And it's, as one of Dr. Cheney's papers reviews has said, increasing access to fresh vegetables and food, that has a lot of value. So I don't want to scare people out of doing that, but I do want people to get their soil tested and know what they're dealing with, and then have a plan to deal with whatever they have. So I think these numbers, these levels, are the most confusing part for a lot of people. So just to summarize, there are background levels of heavy metals that are kind of normal and natural. There are levels that are kind of in between, elevated but not considered too high for residential use by EPA, and in that case you should probably be using some best management practices. And then there are levels that are higher than what the EPA considered safe for residential use, at which point you definitely need to be using some kind of remediation practices, and you should really think about whether it's the right place to grow food. So what can you do once you've got that information? If your heavy metals are at background levels, you can kind of stop there. If you're in that kind of gray elevated zone, this is where you start thinking about best management practices. And as Jared mentioned, with most heavy metals, they luckily stick to the soil really hard if you have appropriate pH. So actually eating the soil is the biggest risk, or breathing in dust, with the exception in particular of cadmium, which can in more cases than other heavy metals be taken up by plants. So if you have elevated levels of cadmium, that's something to think about. And maybe give me and Jared a call and we'll have a look at your numbers. But for the rest of them, soil ingestion is kind of the thing. So if you get your pH in that sweet spot, like 6, 5.5 to 7, I think is what Jared said, you don't need to worry too much about the plant actually picking up the metals. What your management will be trying to keep the soil out of people. The other big difference between heavy metals and the complex organic molecules that we're not talking about that much. Some of those complex organic molecules, like gasoline, will break down over time through microbial processes, through just heat and time. Heavy metals, they don't break down. They're elemental. They're just an element of lead. So they're just kind of there. And because they stick to the soil so tightly, they don't tend to leach out of the soil. So some best management practices, these are pretty standard across the board. Every extension state will tell you these are the basics that you should really be doing. If you've got heavy metals in that gray zone between higher, elevated above background levels but below the EPA's thresholds, so as I mentioned earlier, the primary goal, you want to keep the soil out of people. So what you can do to do that is keeping the soil covered, using mulches, using cover crops, and it's important to think about soil not just where you're growing, but in between, where you might be walking, where children might be playing. Here's a great example in this picture of in between raised beds, using mulch to keep the soil covered. Using raised beds is a very good best management practice if you have soil that if you have soil that you don't want to be growing food in because of heavy metal contamination. The key point there is it doesn't help to just build a raised bed and then put the same soil back in it. You have to actually bring in clean soil from somewhere else in that raised bed. The purpose of the raised bed is to have a space separate from the contaminated soil and have clean soil in it. So what you could do is a lot of the farmers I work with will cap the soil with landscape fabric, kind of keep it in place, and then build the raised bed on top of the landscape fabric, and then import soil or a growth medium. A growth medium is anything like a mix of soil and peat moss, like you grow your potting, or even something that doesn't have any soil in, like you just grow your little transplants in. An important thing there, though, is if you're bringing in soil from somewhere else, do a little research about where it's coming from, because there's not a lot of regulation out there on topsoil. That's not really something that's defined at the state or federal level. There are standards for topsoil for sale. So say you're buying from a stack of soil you see by the side of the road, you really don't know where that came from. It might have been dug up from someone's basement. If you are buying topsoil, ideally you would want to get it from someone that at least is a business that you can go back to if you find out there's a problem with it later, and ideally a source that has tested the soil for heavy metals. And if you go to someone and you see they're selling topsoil and they don't want to give you a test, it's probably worth telling them that that's something they should be providing to their customers. And if, for example, you have access to a lot of free soil, it probably would be worth testing it yourself because you're not having to pay for the soil, but you want to know where it's coming from. So that might be the trade-off there. So keep the soil covered, use raised beds to clean soil in it. When you're leaving the garden, clean your tools, hands, and boots before you bring them out of the garden into other spaces like your house. So you want to keep the soil in the garden. And if you're growing in the native soil, if you're not growing in clean soil and raised beds, say you've got elevated, relatively low contaminant levels, and you want to keep using your regular soil, you don't want to use raised beds, that's when you would start to think about what you're growing. So growing apple trees in relatively low levels of contamination isn't really much of an issue because the apples are grown way high in the air, and you probably have the soil covered all the time by a mulch or a cover crop. So there's not that much chance that the soil will physically contact the apples, right? But if you're growing leafy greens, they're right there on the surface of the soil, and whenever it rains, soil splashes. And if you've ever had a salad that wasn't washed properly and was gritty, you'll know what I mean. A lot of soil just physically gets into leafy greens. So they're a particularly high-risk crop to be growing directly in contaminated soil. So if you want to keep using soil that has a background level of contamination, you might want to think about growing crops that are less likely to physically contact the soil. Like avoid growing leafy greens or root vegetables. Grow instead things that grow high up above the ground. And again, use extra caution when you're gardening with children or pregnant or nursing women. A lot of urban farms have a social impact mission. So if getting kids out into the garden is your mission, then you should absolutely be testing the soil, and you should be more careful based on the results than if just growing food is your mission and you're going to be, and only adults will be working with the soil, right? Because as we mentioned, with heavy metals, kids are more at risk because they're still growing, and physically getting the soil into your mouth is the highest risk, and kids gardening in the ground are a lot more likely to get the soil in their mouths than if, like I said, you're growing an apple that never touches the soil and then you sell it to someone. So here is a list of references that we used while developing this presentation that I found helpful, and I think you will have access to a copy of this presentation. I'm going to switch to our question slide. I know we're going to wrap up now. It would be awesome if you would be willing to go to that link there and evaluate my teaching. The public servant, you the public, get to grade my work. I see a few questions in the chat box. The only one, is it being recorded? Yes, it's being recorded. And I think it'll be put up on the Women in Agriculture website. With heavy metals, are raised beds okay? Yes, we talked, as I think if we talked about that, and you put that question in long before we got to that. If you have, I would still recommend getting your soil tested to know what you're dealing with, because you might not, A, you might not have contaminated soil, and B, if you do and you want to use raised beds instead, you still want to know what the levels are, because if you have very, very high levels, then again you need to make sure there's no bare soil that could get tracked elsewhere and could get into humans through dust or on your hands. So it's worth knowing what you're dealing with. But yes, then raised beds are a very good best management practice to cover contaminated soil and grow in imported clean soil. Are there any other questions for me or Jared? Well, thank you all so much for spending your lunch hour with us. It's been fun, and maybe we can come back next year to give a bit of an update. This was kind of soil contamination 101, focused in particular on heavy metals. There's a lot more to it, and I know we're both interested in learning more and teaching more.